the handcuffs locked around Naomi Pierce's wrists outside the iron gate of the estate that bore her name on the deed. The officer never checked her paperwork, and the neighbor watching from across the street smiled like a man who had caught a trespasser. Naomi told them they were making a mistake, but Lieutenant Grant Huxley ordered her to stop pretending she lived there. The moment he reached for the patrol car door, the front entrance swung open. Governor Evelyn Whitmore stepped out with her security detail, looked at the handcuffs, and asked, "Who ordered the arrest of the owner of this house? If you believe the truth eventually speaks for itself, stay with this story and watch Naomi turn humiliation into real and lasting justice." Naomi Pierce did not drive to Waverly House that afternoon in any vehicle that announced what she was worth, and she was not wearing anything a stranger would have read as wealth or authority. She had come directly from a strategy session at Pierce Civic Technologies, the emergency communications firm she had founded and built into a 10-year-old company with government contracts across 4 states. Wearing a plain charcoal jacket, dark slacks, and a company badge she had not bothered to remove, the estate rose at the end of Waverly Heights' longest residential block. 4 stories of federal-style architecture with bone-white columns, and a wrought iron gate that had been corroding quietly for years before Naomi's money put it back together. 6 months earlier, she had purchased the property from a family that had spent 2 generations losing the fortune their grandparents had built, and in the intervening months she had poured millions into the restoration. She had not done this to place herself visibly among the neighborhood's other wealthy residents, and she would have been the first person to say so. What Waverly House meant to her went back to a morning she had never forgotten. When she was 7 years old, and her mother had pressed a code into the service entrance panel, because the family whose name was on the deed maintained a firm understanding of which doors were intended for which kind of people. Lillian Pierce had cleaned Waverly House for 11 years, arriving before sunrise and leaving after dark, always through the rear entrance, always without remark, because the conditions of her employment had been designed to make remark feel inappropriate. Naomi had watched her mother perform that ritual many times during childhood visits, and the image, the service door, the separate path, the architectural instruction embedded in a building's back face, had settled into her in a way that money and distance never fully displaced. When the estate came onto the market, Naomi did not spend long deciding. She intended to transform its eastern wing into a tuition-free training center for minority women entering technology, civic management, and public policy, a purpose that several of the neighborhood's current residents found, at minimum, inconvenient. The Waverly Heights community's primary objection was not that the center would create noise or traffic, though those concerns were raised at meetings. The objection, stripped of its formal language, was that the center would alter who belonged in the neighborhood, and signal that belonging was not something the existing residents could continue to manage. Preston Vale, who presided over a real estate portfolio under the name Vale Dominion Properties, and served as the Residents Association chairman, had made his specific objection clear through multiple direct offers to purchase the property. Each offer had been higher than the one before it, and each refusal had arrived with the same calm Naomi brought to every negotiation she had ever won. When money failed to move her, the Residents Association developed other tools. Complaints began arriving at a rate that did not correspond to any change in Naomi's own behavior. Delivery vehicles said to have parked too long on the street. Guests who had arrived without notifying the association office in the required window. Exterior lighting that allegedly violated a specification no one could locate in the actual governing documents. Naomi documented every letter and responded to each through her attorney's office, which had the effect of ending specific complaints while producing new ones. She had hired a property manager experienced with precisely this kind of institutional friction, and after 3 months on the job, that manager confirmed what Naomi had already suspected. The timing of the complaints correlated, with unusual precision, to the dates on which she had declined each of Preston Vale's purchase offers, and the association's own records were not sophisticated enough to conceal that pattern. On the afternoon the incident occurred, Naomi was expecting Governor Evelyn Whitmore at 4 o'clock for a classified briefing about a vulnerability the state's technology team had identified in its emergency dispatch network, infrastructure that Pierce Civic Technologies had built and still maintained. The governor's team had arranged the visit quietly, routing her convoy through the estate's rear entrance to avoid press attention. Naomi had stepped outside through the front gate to retrieve a sealed briefing folder from her car, and the gate's automatic system had closed behind her while she was still at the vehicle. She entered the override code on the exterior panel, the same code she had used without difficulty dozens of times. But a contractor had recalibrated the entry timing mechanism earlier that week, and the sequence required 2 additional seconds to register. Preston Vale was standing at the window of his estate across the street and had been watching the panel for nearly 3 minutes before he reached for his phone. He told the dispatcher there was a suspicious woman outside the house at the Waverly Heights address, that she appeared to be attempting to gain access to the property, and that the actual owner was not present. 2 patrol vehicles arrived within 4 minutes. Lieutenant Grant Huckle stepped out of the first vehicle, a broad man of 44, with the practiced composure of someone who had spent 17 years acting on first impressions, before they were confirmed. He scanned Naomi's face, her jacket, and the portfolio under her arm, with the quick inventory of someone who had already reached a working conclusion before stepping out of the car. And what he decided in that first scan was not available for revision by anything she said afterward. Officer Tessa Rowe followed from the passenger side, scanning the gate, the keypad panel, and the woman standing beside it with the attention of someone who had not yet learned to trust her instincts as completely as her supervisor had. Huxley did not ask whether Naomi needed assistance, and he did not approach her the way an officer approaches a person he has determined might be a resident. His opening instruction was for her to step back from the gate, delivered at a volume intended to establish control of the scene rather than begin a conversation, and the effect it produced on the neighbors drifting toward their lawns was the effect it was designed to produce. Naomi stepped back and stated clearly, without raising her voice, that she owned the property and had been briefly locked out by a recent system update. She produced her driver's license and unlocked her phone to display the security application that gave her direct control over every door, camera, and light switch on the estate, and its live feed showed 3 exterior camera angles, and on a second screen, the interior of the front entrance hall, where no unauthorized person was present. Huxley found the detail he needed in the license. The address listed was Naomi's previous apartment, which she had not updated with the licensing agency since moving to the estate. The property was held under the name Pierce Heritage Trust, the entity her attorney had established for asset protection purposes, meaning a standard database query would not return her full name against the property address. He used both facts to dismiss her account, telling her that the address did not match and that a trust document was not something he could verify on a sidewalk. Naomi offered to call the county land registry office and offered to have her attorney on the line within minutes. Huxley told her that people who broke into homes always had a prepared explanation. Tessa Rowe had been watching the phone application and understood clearly that the ability to toggle the estate's locks, lights, and cameras in real time was not a capability belonging to someone who had walked up from the street. She started to say so, and Huxley cut her off without turning around. Preston Vale crossed the street at this moment, with the measured pace of a man performing the role of concerned neighbor, telling the officers he had never seen the woman at the gate living at that address, and that the actual owner was, as far as he was aware, rarely on site. Naomi looked directly at Preston and reminded him that they had been seated across from each other at the Residents Association meeting 3 days earlier, an exchange that had included a specific argument about the Eastern Wing construction timeline. Preston said he might be confusing her with someone else. Huxley accepted this without a single follow-up question, and the instruction came next: turn around and place her hands on the vehicle. Naomi did not resist, but she asked Huxley to confirm that his body camera was recording before she complied. He said it was, and the indicator light on the device said otherwise, and no one in authority drew attention to the discrepancy. Tessa quietly activated her own camera without speaking. Huxley secured the handcuffs with more pressure than the situation required. And while he did so, he said that Naomi needed to understand her position, and the words sat in the air in a way that had nothing to do with geography. Naomi asked which position he meant. He told her that her attitude was making an already complicated situation worse, and the neighbors who had gathered watched without speaking, several of them recording with their phones. And Preston Vale stood near his iron fence, in the posture of a man waiting for something he had arranged to reach its conclusion. Naomi recognized the exact nature of the moment. Not a misidentification that would resolve itself in the next few minutes, but a decision that had been reached before the officers finished parking. A decision about what category of person she was allowed to represent in front of this gate. The handcuffs were the least significant element of what was happening. The significant part was the architecture of the scene. An officer who had accepted a neighbor's word against hers, without pausing to test either. A neighbor who had greeted her by name at a meeting 72 hours earlier, and now claimed not to recognize her. And a mechanism of institutional authority pointed in her direction by someone who wanted her somewhere else. She stood with her hands behind her and her head level, and gave Huxley nothing that could be entered into a report as evidence of the behavior he was looking for. Huxley moved toward the patrol car door. The front door of Waverly House opened while Huxley still had one hand extended toward the vehicle, and the figure who appeared at the top of the entrance steps arrived with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had decided to see for herself what was taking so long. Governor Evelyn Whitmore was 56 years old, with the posture and measured economy of a person who had spent 3 decades in rooms, where the balance of power shifted by the minute, and had learned to assess a scene completely, before responding to any part of it. She was flanked by the head of her state security detail and 2 senior policy advisors, and the 4 of them stood at the top of the steps for exactly as long as it took the governor to understand what she was looking at. Huxley's bearing changed the moment he registered who had appeared at the door, spine straightening, chin lifting, and he addressed her with the deference that people trained in hierarchy produce automatically when a higher rank arrives unexpectedly. He told her the officers had responded to a reported trespass and were completing the verification process. The governor asked whose property the trespass had been reported on. Huxley indicated the mansion. Evelyn said, without apparent surprise, that the property belonged to Naomi Pierce. The same Naomi Pierce who had been chairing a classified briefing session inside the building for the past 40 minutes, before stepping outside to retrieve documents. The neighbors who had remained on their lawns absorbed this in the particular silence of people who have discovered that the story they were watching is different from the one they believed they were watching. Preston Vale began a measured withdrawal toward his own front entrance, each step unhurried, the gait of a man who has decided that moving slowly with apparent purpose is the only available middle option. Huxley mentioned the call, stating that the caller had told dispatch the woman at the gate was not the owner of record. Evelyn looked toward Preston's retreating figure and asked directly whether he had placed it. Preston said he had not, suggesting a pedestrian might have called it in, though no pedestrians were visible on the street in either direction. Naomi did not raise her voice and did not invoke the governor's presence as a form of retaliation. She stated 2 things. She wanted the handcuffs removed, and she wanted every piece of data from the encounter preserved before anything was altered or lost. Huxley removed the restraints with the expression of a man performing a professional courtesy, rather than acknowledging an error, and he described the incident as a standard verification procedure that had reached its natural conclusion. Naomi asked why a standard verification procedure had not included querying a publicly accessible deed registry, testing whether the access codes on her phone actually opened the gate, or calling the attorney whose card she had offered within the first 2 minutes of the encounter. Huxley did not answer, and Tessa Rowe stood 2 steps behind her supervisor, with a face composed into an expression that had cost her something to maintain. The head of the governor's security detail had already pulled up the state's pre-cleared visitor registry on his phone, where Naomi Pierce appeared with the estate's current address, her confirmed status as the day's briefing host, and the standard clearance notation. He showed it to Huxley, and Huxley read it, and the reading produced no statement of regret. Evelyn placed a call to Chief Malcolm Rourke and directed him to the address, issuing an explicit preservation order covering all camera footage, dispatch audio, and communication logs from the preceding 90 minutes. Huxley's expression shifted when he heard the words camera footage, because his device had not been recording during any of the time that mattered. Tessa found a moment beside Naomi and said quietly that her camera had captured almost everything from near the beginning. Naomi thanked her and said that what Tessa chose to do with the recording would be entirely Tessa's decision to make. Rourke arrived 14 minutes later and directed his first apology toward the governor before directing a second one toward Naomi, and that ordering told Naomi everything she needed to understand about the department's actual accountability structure. He proposed handling the matter privately through a formal departmental review and used the phrase regrettable misunderstanding twice in the space of 90 seconds. Naomi did not shake his hand and told him plainly that what had occurred was not a misunderstanding, but a sequence of conscious choices. An officer had concluded she was lying before examining a single piece of evidence, had accepted a neighbor's unsupported account as more credible than her documented ownership, and had processed her as an intruder in front of her own gate. By the time the patrol vehicles pulled away, a recording taken on a neighbor's phone had appeared online, and the clip began at the moment the governor stepped through the door, which meant every person who watched it saw only Naomi being released. And the story that clip told was that a black woman had avoided arrest because she happened to know someone with political standing. The morning coverage arrived split, and the split had been shaped. One interpretation held that what had happened outside Waverly House was a precise illustration of how institutional authority treated black property owners, a presumption of illegitimacy that no amount of documentation could quickly overcome, while the other interpretation suggested that Naomi Pierce was a wealthy businesswoman with political connections who had weaponized an unfortunate encounter. The second interpretation was proliferating with a velocity that did not entirely reflect organic public opinion. The Ashbourne Police Department released a formal statement describing the responding officers as having acted on a credible call, noting that the subject had initially declined to provide satisfactory verification, and that the situation had been resolved through proper channels. The word declined was doing significant rhetorical work in that sentence, and Naomi read it several times. Huxley's own statement followed in the afternoon, expressing regret for confusion, while making clear he had responded appropriately to the information available, and had no knowledge of the complainant's identity at the time of the encounter, and he did not mention the camera. Preston Vale appeared briefly on the steps of his estate for a local outlet, describing Naomi as a successful woman with remarkable achievements who had a pattern of framing routine community disagreements in racial terms, and saying he had never opposed her presence in the neighborhood and wished her enterprise nothing but success. A regional publication ran a photograph of Naomi and the governor at a state technology summit from the previous year, alongside questions about whether the arrest had concluded because of evidence or because of access. The board of Pierce Civic Technologies convened within 48 hours, and 3 members argued that a protracted public confrontation with the police department could jeopardize the company's state contracts, pointing out that even a justified legal fight created friction in professional relationships that mattered to the business. A 4th member used the phrase regrettable distraction twice in the same quarter hour without appearing to notice. The collective message, wrapped in various registers of corporate caution, was that Naomi should accept whatever settlement was being quietly offered, issue a statement calling for constructive dialogue, and allow the incident to disappear. Naomi sat at the head of the board table and listened to all of it before she said a word, and when she spoke, she described the estate in terms most of the board members had not encountered. Her mother had cleaned its floors for 11 years and had been required to use the service entrance because the front door was not available to someone in her position. And the only reason Naomi had purchased the property was to make it operate by different rules. She said that accepting a private apology and a confidential settlement in exchange for silence would leave the building standing and change nothing about what it represented, and that the only honest measure of whether she had accomplished what she came to accomplish was whether the system that had processed her as a trespasser outside her own gate faced any consequence at all. The board reached a narrow decision to allow her to continue. Camille Brooks arrived at Waverly House that evening, carrying a hard drive and a set of preservation requests already filed, and she did not open with reassurances because 17 years of civil rights litigation had cured her of the belief that reassurance helped anyone. She accessed the property's full security archive and identified 2 recordings that required no interpretation. The camera above the front gate had a field of view wide enough to include a section of the street beyond, and that view showed Preston Vale standing at his drawing room window, watching Naomi at the keypad for nearly 3 minutes before he moved to his phone. A second camera, positioned to cover the North Garden access, had captured an outdoor exchange between Naomi and Preston from 7 days earlier, a brief encounter in which he had called her by name and they had exchanged words about a construction boundary. Together, the 2 recordings established that Preston knew precisely who was standing at the gate and had made a deliberate decision to describe her as someone else. The dispatch recording presented a different complication. The department had not released the original audio. It had provided a written summary stating that the caller had reported an unknown individual attempting to gain entry to a private residence, and the summary contained no direct quotation and no caller identification. Camille filed an emergency preservation demand that same night and submitted the initial complaint for a civil action naming Huxley and the department. Naomi reviewed Huxley's incident report and found a line that required a second reading. It stated that the subject had attempted to use an electronic device to circumvent authorized security protocols, which meant that the phone application she had shown as proof of ownership had been reframed in official documentation as evidence of an attempt to defeat security systems. Naomi wanted to release everything immediately: the camera footage, the report's wording, the discrepancy between the department's summary and what the recordings showed. Camille talked her out of it with a single argument. If they showed what they had now, the other side would spend weeks building explanations in advance, and explanations constructed before evidence appeared publicly were harder to dismantle than ones assembled on the spot. The investigation Camille conducted over the following 2 weeks did not find a single incident. It found a record, and the record had a shape. Through public document requests, court filings, and direct outreach to previous complainants, she assembled a profile of Grant Huxley's 17-year career that looked very different from the picture the department's internal reviews had produced. 7 formal complaints had been filed against him over that period, 3 from white civilians and 4 from black civilians. The 3 cases involving white civilians had all been closed with minimal documentation and no formal finding. The 4 cases involving black civilians shared a structural pattern with the Waverly House incident that was specific enough to constitute a method rather than a coincidence. Authority established before evidence was gathered, a secondary witness who was either absent or silenced, and a subject left to absorb the consequences of an encounter that the department's own records described as within guidelines. Dr. Raymond Ellison was a cardiologist who had been stopped outside his own medical practice in downtown Ashbourne after a caller described a suspicious man near the building's entrance. Detained for 22 minutes while officers attempted to reach the building's owner, who was Ellison himself, a fact available in the city's property registry that no one had checked. Earl Whitfield was a retired Army sergeant with 22 years of service who had been handcuffed in his own driveway because the vehicle beside him matched the broad description of one reported stolen in a different county, despite the car being registered in Whitfield's name in the same database accessible from Huxley's patrol terminal. Professor Diana Moss had rented a vacation property outside the city and been asked 3 times to explain her presence there, the responding officer having been informed by an unidentified caller that someone was accessing the premises without authorization. In each case, the formal complaint was reviewed by an internal affairs unit whose chain of command ran directly to Chief Rourke, and in each case the outcome arrived within 60 days. Insufficient evidence, or conduct within guidelines, or a notation too brief to constitute a real record. The financial threat arrived through a combination of public campaign finance records and documents Camille's contact at a civic watchdog organization had been accumulating for a separate purpose. Vale Dominion Properties had contributed at scale to the mayor's last 2 elections, legal and unremarkable on the surface. More significant was a sponsorship arrangement under which the company had provided the police department's fleet with vehicle-mounted mobile computing terminals and had funded a drone acquisition program, both structured as annual contributions requiring renewal, which gave Vale Dominion a recurring point of leverage over a department that had built operational capacity around the equipment. Camille noted that the contract's next renewal date fell within the same fiscal quarter as the upcoming Residents Association vote on the Eastern Wing project, and she did not treat the timing as a coincidence and did not present it as one. A former mid-level employee of Vale Dominion contacted Naomi's attorney through an intermediary and requested confidentiality. He described a meeting in which Preston had laid out the economics of the Waverly House problem in unambiguous terms. The estate sat on the only parcel, providing direct corridor access between a resort development under construction and the county road system required to meet zoning thresholds. And without that corridor, the project's financing structure would fail. The figure he had heard mentioned was $240 million. The amount already committed that would be at risk if Naomi refused to sell. The directive that followed had been explicit. Find every available mechanism to make her feel like she doesn't belong there. The former employee had no document connecting Preston directly to the call to police, but he was specific about the strategy. And the strategy aligned precisely with everything Camille had already found. The dispatch audio arrived under court order on a Thursday afternoon, and Camille played it twice before she allowed Naomi to hear it. The recording was 94 seconds long. In those 94 seconds, the caller stated Naomi's full name, described her physical location with precision, provided the estate's address, and then said that the actual owner was not present. The name came before the description of the supposed intruder, which meant that whoever was listening would have had to hold 2 pieces of information simultaneously. Preston knew who was standing at the gate, and he had described that person as someone who did not belong there. The recording removed the possibility that the call had been made in genuine confusion about who was standing at the keypad. Tessa Rowe made her decision on a Friday evening in a parking structure 3 blocks from the county courthouse, and she handed Naomi's attorney a drive containing a complete copy of her body camera recording without offering any explanation for how long she had held it. She said she had waited longer than she should have, and she said it plainly, without the kind of language that softens an admission by redirecting its weight. The footage documented Huxley dismissing the security application, cutting off Tessa's attempt to speak, and using the words "know your position" in a tone that was deliberate rather than incidental. The camera's microphone had also captured 37 seconds of audio from the edge of the scene, a brief exchange between Huxley and Preston Vale that no other recording had reached. In that exchange, Preston's voice said, "I just need her to understand this place isn't for her." Huxley replied, "I'll handle it." The exchange was quiet and brief and entirely sufficient. The city council hearing on police department conduct took place on a Tuesday morning, and the chamber filled before 8 with the specific energy of a room where people have come to watch something happen, rather than to participate in a process. Reporters claimed the gallery seats first, and by 9 a line of residents extended down the hall and around the corner. Huxley arrived in full-dress uniform with the department's union representative beside him, and the composure of a man who had sat before review panels before and walked out afterward and gone to work the next morning. Preston Vale occupied a front-row seat in the public gallery, flanked by 3 attorneys, and arranged himself with the stillness of someone conserving energy. For a moment he expected to be routine. Chief Rourke addressed the council first, and his remarks occupied the careful territory between institutional explanation and deflection, offering sympathy for the difficulty of law enforcement decisions, without addressing any specific fact, and characterizing the decision to hold a public hearing as an escalation of a matter that had been available for private resolution. Huxley's testimony was brief and consistent. He had received a call describing a suspicious individual at a residential address. He had responded, he had asked for identification. The documentation provided had not matched the property's listed owner, and he had proceeded according to protocol while awaiting verification. He described Naomi as initially uncooperative and said her demeanor had complicated efforts to reach a quick resolution, and he did not mention the camera at any point. Preston's legal team submitted a written statement confirming he had not placed the call, had approached the scene out of neighborly concern, and that any suggestion of deliberate interference with another resident's property rights was entirely false, noting his long record of civic contribution and public safety support. Rourke followed with a statement suggesting the investigation had identified the relevant facts and that the appropriate forum for resolution was the internal review process, and he used the phrase ongoing review 3 times, as though repetition could give it the weight the facts would not. Naomi spoke last and did not position herself as a victim, a success story, or a person whose credentials entitled her to different treatment. She outlined a sequence of decisions, each specific and verifiable. Huxley had concluded she was not the property's owner before checking a publicly accessible deed registry, before calling the number on her attorney's business card, before testing whether the access codes on her phone actually opened the gate, before requesting a second opinion from his own partner, and before asking the simplest question any honest inquiry would begin with, which was whether she could demonstrate direct control over the building. A council member asked whether she believed race had influenced the officer's conduct. Naomi said the room did not need to reconstruct what was in Huxley's mind. It only needed to compare the evidentiary standard he had applied to her, word against the standard he had applied to an anonymous call, and to ask what principle explained why one had been treated as reliable and the other had been treated as a prepared story. Huxley's response came in the form of a slight compression of the lips and a statement that the complainant was retroactively reframing a difficult professional situation in order to adopt the posture of a victim. He said it with the ease of a man who had deployed that particular response before and watched it close a conversation. It was the most contemptuous thing said in the chamber that morning, and Camille Brooks had been positioned precisely to let it land before she stood and requested permission to present recorded evidence. The chamber screen displayed Tessa Rowe's body camera footage, and the room watched Naomi produce the security application, watched Huxley wave it aside without examination, watched Tessa begin to speak and be cut off, and heard the words, "Know your position," delivered without hesitation or any apparent awareness that they would be heard again in a room that could act on them. The footage ran 41 seconds. The dispatch recording followed, 94 seconds, the name first, the description of an intruder second, the assurance that the actual owner was absent third, and then the audio of the exchange between Preston and Huxley played, and the words, "This place isn't for her," arrived in the chamber, with the quality of something that had been waiting to be heard in a room that could act on it. Preston told his attorneys, at a volume insufficient to remain private, that the recording had been taken entirely out of context. The council member who had asked Naomi about race made a note she did not share with anyone. The state's lead investigator leaned toward a colleague and said that the fund transfers were going to require separate proceedings. Governor Whitmore had been seated in the gallery's rear section throughout the hearing as a private observer, and she had not spoken, and she stood now. She said the state had already opened an independent investigation into the falsification of official reports and the obstruction of camera data, and she said, with the precision of someone who had chosen each word before entering the room, that her presence at Waverly House on the day of the arrest had not informed the investigation and would not determine its outcome, because the standard governing how officers treated civilians was not supposed to depend on whether a particular civilian happened to know someone with political standing. The chamber produced the particular silence of a room in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid. The consulting arrangement that investigators found at the center of the financial relationship had been designed to look like nothing. A firm called Apex Civic Strategies had been registered 4 years earlier at a commercial mailbox address outside the city, and its only named principal was Derek Huxley, the lieutenant's older brother, who had left a facilities management position under circumstances none of the available records specified. The firm had no employees, no client-facing presence, no documented project portfolio, and no clients on record at any point in its existence except Vale Dominion Properties, which had been billing the firm $8,000 per month for security planning and risk assessment services since the registration date. The payments were structured to resemble the kind of consultancy arrangement that appears in dozens of corporate budgets without drawing attention, and they had been successful at that for 4 years. State investigators identified 2 periods during which the payments had increased significantly. The first aligned with permit disputes that had slowed an earlier Vale Dominion development, disputes resolved following a documented increase in police presence at public meetings where opposition was organizing. The second began in the months after Naomi's purchase of Waverly House, during which patrol GPS logs showed that Huxley's vehicle had made significantly more passes along the Waverly Heights block than his unit's assignment data could explain. The frequency had more than doubled against the prior year's baseline, concentrated in the weeks that followed each of Naomi's refusals to sell, and a senior analyst flagged the pattern on her first review as an anomaly that required explanation the department's own records could not provide. Preston arranged a private meeting through intermediary counsel, and the offer he brought was constructed with the confidence of a man who had resolved difficult situations with large figures before, and expected this one to respond the same way. He placed on the table a purchase price 3 times the current assessed market value of Waverly House, an endowment of $3 million for a technology training program at any location Naomi chose elsewhere in the city, and a public statement acknowledging that the events of the day in question had been, in his word, unfortunate. In exchange, Naomi would withdraw all pending legal actions, execute a confidentiality clause covering the settlement terms, and refrain from discussing Vale Dominion Properties in any forum connected to the case. Preston spoke throughout, in the register of a man who believed he was participating in a negotiation rather than presenting a bribe, and he said, as though summarizing a principle he had found reliable across many years, that everyone had a number. Naomi waited until he had finished and then asked whether her mother had had a number, whether there had existed, at any point during 11 years of cleaning that house, a figure large enough that Lillian Pierce might have been offered the use of the front door. Preston did not understand the question's frame of reference and moved to the next item on his offer. Naomi declined, and his register shifted from cooperative to instructive, and he told her that government contracts operated in an environment of relationships, that relationships required maintenance, and that a sustained public conflict with a major civic donor was not a maintenance strategy. He said that investigative journalism had a long institutional memory for corporate governance problems, and that Pierce Civic Technologies had a history that others might choose to examine. Naomi thanked him for the meeting. Her attorney noted, at the session's close, that the discussion had been recorded in accordance with the applicable notification provisions that governed the location where the meeting was held. Huxley reached his own calculation, within days of the state's announcement that grand jury proceedings were being considered. He contacted the district attorney's office through his personal attorney and offered cooperation in exchange for consideration, and the cooperation was specific. He provided a collection of electronic communications, text threads, and emails, in which Preston had directed him to increase patrol emphasis on Waverly Heights and to treat any dispatch call connected to the estate's address as a priority response. One message, sent 3 weeks before the arrest, read, "She needs to understand this isn't going to get easier." Investigators also found that Rourke had been aware of Huxley's patrol reassigned to the Waverly Heights corridor for at least 8 months, and that a complaint from a resident about the frequency of drive-bys had been received, acknowledged, and placed in a drawer. Rourke had not issued the order that led to Naomi's arrest, but he had spent years creating and protecting the conditions in which that order could be given, and its consequences managed without accountability. Tessa Rowe was placed on administrative suspension for having copied department footage without authorization, and the suspension became a story of its own that generated more public attention than the department had anticipated, shifting the timeline of the Oversight Commission's public report. Naomi went to see Tessa during the suspension and told her that doing the right thing did not retroactively cancel the period in which she had not done it, but that what mattered now was which of the two decisions would determine who Tessa became from that point forward. Tessa agreed to appear before the grand jury and answer every question completely. Preston's press conference lasted 11 minutes, and the statement he read had clearly been produced by someone whose primary training was in crisis management, rather than factual accuracy. He announced that new evidence had emerged demonstrating that Naomi Pierce had attempted to leverage the arrest incident into a financial extraction, and that the campaign of accusations against him was not, at its core, about civil rights or justice, but about money. He played a 40-second audio clip drawn from the private meeting at his attorney's office, and in the edited version, the sequence of the conversation had been reversed, in a way that made Naomi's voice appear to be naming a figure as the price of her silence, stripping from the recording the preceding 20 minutes, in which Preston had placed that figure on the table, and she had declined it. The clip dropped into the public conversation with the precision of a detonation that had been timed and positioned. Pierce Civic Technologies stock fell 7% in the following trading session, and 3 institutional shareholders issued statements expressing concern about the company's exposure. Coverage shifted. Naomi was no longer framed solely as the subject of discriminatory policing, but as a question. A wealthy businesswoman who might have used a legitimate grievance as leverage in a larger financial play. Camille had anticipated something in this direction and had maintained 3 authenticated copies of the full meeting recording, each with a verified timestamp embedded in the file metadata. The complete session was 53 minutes long, and in those 53 minutes the sequence was unambiguous. Preston had offered money, Naomi had declined, and the figure audible in his edited clip was one he had placed on the table, not one she had named. Naomi authorized Camille to release the complete recording without conditions. The full audio arrived in newsrooms that evening, and by the following morning investigators had traced the editing software to a device registered to a communications consultant whose firm appeared in Vale Dominion's vendor records for the previous fiscal year. A reporter who had been working the real estate angle of the story for 2 weeks simultaneously published internal Vale Dominion correspondence obtained through a source she declined to name. The emails included one in which Preston described Naomi as an obstacle who doesn't know her place, and another, sent the week after her purchase of the estate, directing his property and legal teams to develop a sustained pressure strategy intended to make the asset uncomfortable enough to become willing. The phrase, "this place isn't for her," appeared in one of the emails, originating from Preston, and that phrase had now surfaced in 3 separate contexts: a private email, a conversation captured on Tessa's camera, and the record of a city council hearing. The institutional collapse that followed was not dramatic but was complete. Vale Dominion's board of directors removed Preston as chairman pending the outcome of criminal proceedings, citing fiduciary responsibility and reputational exposure. 3 anchor investors formally withdrew from the resort development project. Chief Rourke submitted his resignation to the mayor's office on a Monday afternoon, citing personal reasons, ahead of a no-confidence vote that had already been calendared. Huxley was terminated following the completion of the independent review, which concluded that he had filed a materially false incident report, had failed to activate his recording equipment in violation of department policy, and had received ongoing financial benefit from a private party with a direct and documented interest in his enforcement conduct. The criminal indictment of Preston Vale named counts of filing a false police report, commercial bribery, obstruction of a civil rights investigation, and conspiracy to deprive a citizen of property rights through the misuse of public authority. Naomi was in the garden of Waverly House when Camille called to relay the indictment, and she sat with the information for a long moment before saying anything. She understood that an indictment was not accountability, and that accountability for one person at one address did not extend backward to the 7 complaints that had been closed without consequence. The city announced it was reopening every formal complaint associated with Huxley's tenure, and the people who had filed those complaints were contacted and invited to provide testimony. Tessa was reinstated following the Oversight Commission's review, but declined the promotional reassignment that was offered, saying she preferred to return to her current position and rebuild what she had lost through something other than a transfer. 6 months after the arrest, the eastern wing of Waverly House opened to its first cohort, and the occasion looked nothing like any event the building's previous owners would have recognized. There was no invitation list managed by a committee, no catered reception for the residents of Waverly Heights, and no distinction drawn at the entrance between people whose presence had been anticipated and those whose presence had always required explanation. A bronze plaque beside the wing's entrance identified the space as the Lillian Pierce Center for Civic Education and Technology, and the ribbon Naomi cut to open the doors had been purchased from the same supply store where the center's first cohort of 38 women would buy their notebooks. The cohort had been selected through applications submitted by community organizations across 5 counties, most of them holding full-time jobs, several having arranged childcare for evening sessions, a few having applied to similar programs before and been told, in various registers of institutional language, that they were not the right fit. The service entrance at the rear of the property still existed, and Naomi had kept it deliberately intact. An exhibition panel installed beside it explained the entrance's original purpose, the social logic that had made that purpose feel natural to those who enforced it, and the names of individuals who had used it across the building's history, including Lillian Pierce, who had pressed that exterior panel for 11 years in silence, because silence was the only option the conditions of her employment had made available. The front door of the estate was propped open throughout the ceremony and would remain open, according to the posted schedule, during every operating hour of the center. Governor Whitmore attended without a press pool or a motorcade and announced a legislative package the state assembly had already passed in the prior session. The package required automatic upload of officer-worn camera footage to an independent server at the conclusion of every recorded encounter, prohibited manual deactivation of recording equipment during any civilian interaction, mandated property verification before any arrest at a private residence except in documented cases of immediate threat, and established an external oversight board with independent investigative authority over departmental conduct. News organizations had taken to calling the legislation the Pierce Accountability Act, and Naomi had asked them repeatedly to stop, pointing out that 7 people had filed complaints against the same officer without producing the same political traction, and that the act belonged to them more honestly than it belonged to her. Tessa Rowe arrived in ordinary clothes and waited near the edge of the gathering rather than positioning herself near the podium. Naomi found her after the formal portion concluded, and Tessa said she was sorry she had taken as long as she had, and she did not add any reasoning to the apology or soften it with mitigation. Naomi said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that fear was not going to be the final word. Camille presented the final civil judgment that afternoon, and the damages figure it awarded went directly into a legal defense fund Naomi had established for individuals facing civil rights violations in housing and public accommodation disputes, administered by a board that included 3 of the 7 previous Huxley complainants. The fund's eligibility criteria specified, as a condition, that the applicant's account had been disbelieved before their evidence was examined. When the guests had left and the first students had gone home with their orientation folders, Naomi stood alone at the front gate, the same gate where the handcuffs had closed around her wrists, and stayed there long enough to let the memory settle without trying to resolve it into something tidier than it was. She thought about the word position, about what Huxley had meant when he used it, and what the word had meant across decades to every person who had moved through that building, the way her mother had moved through it, quietly and through the back. The gate was open behind her, and the front door was still propped wide, and the light from the entrance hall fell across the stone steps in the early evening. A group of students came back for something one of them had left inside and paused at the foot of the steps, and Naomi held the door open and told them to go ahead. They had locked her out of the gate of her own estate, certain she could not be the one who owned it. In the end, she was the one who kept the door open, the same door that had once been shut to everyone who looked like her. And that was the answer she had been building toward since the night she bought the place.